understand is Vietnam lasts from 1954 until 1975, and it will go over the course of 5 U.S. presidencies, okay? Our involvement there begins, actually even arguably before that, our involvement in there begins at the close of World War II. So if you wanted, you could even include Truman in that list. But Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and if, like I said, 5 presidencies, if we include the Truman presidency in there. You could also count Ford, kind of, because Ford proclaims that the war is finished. So kind of he can be counted in there as well, all right? So kind of understand that concept that it occurs over several different presidencies and will largely affect the presidencies of those individuals, all right? And as a result of it, the United States largely has a dramatic shift after or during the Vietnam War from supporting war as a whole to looking at war in a much more critical light and questioning the moves of our government, especially when it involves us in foreign affairs and conflict. And so that still exists within the United States versus pre-Vietnam, where the United States largely went along with whatever our government wanted to do militarily. Does that make sense? When we go to war in World War I, Americans rally behind that. When we go to war in World War II, Americans rally behind that. When we go to war in the Korean conflict, Americans largely are not affected by it because it doesn't last very long, okay? When we go to war in Vietnam, initially Americans are like rallying behind it. By the end of the war, no way, okay? And now if you look at our modern war, and most recently our operation in Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Americans were heavily critical of the Bush administration and whether or not we should actually be involved in that war or not, especially when it comes out as to whether or not there were actually weapons of mass destruction or not, okay? And we could never find any weapons of mass destruction, so... But they become much more critical of it. Now, when we look at Vietnam, the problems for Vietnam actually began even prior to World War II. Vietnam was a French colony. It was part of French Indochina. In 1941, Japan will invade Vietnam and then take control of Vietnam until the end of the war. Now, in the end of the war in 1945, then, Ho Chi Minh, who believes in or is a more communist-leaning leader and is supported and backed by communist Russia, declares that Vietnam is now an independent country and that it is now a communist independent country. All right? But, right? Yeah. I don't think so. We can't allow Vietnam to be a communist state. And France is like, I don't think so, Vietnam. You don't get to just decide you're free now. You are part of our country. You are going to be a part of our country. Okay? Just because Japan invaded you and now Japan's been kicked out doesn't mean you get a self-determination. What are you thinking, Vietnam? I don't think so. So... as a result of that fear spread of communism, but also as a result of the French, we will see our involvement in Vietnam begin immediately following that, okay? Now, initially, most of that fighting over Vietnam occurs between the French and the Vietnamese, okay, and the Ho Chi Minh's forces. So from 1946 until 1954, it's predominantly the French there, okay? The United States really has no involvement in Vietnam other than Truman saying, no, you're not going to become a communist state, okay? Nice try, Vietnam, but no, okay? Now, in 1954, though, France is largely running out of money and supplies and the ability to actually continue to fight in Vietnam and try to prevent them from becoming a communist state. So France makes the decision to withdraw from Vietnam. But it's 1954, and in 1949, China fell to communism, right? It is post-Korean War, and we have seen North Korea retain as a communist state. We don't want to allow Vietnam to go the same way that China did. In fact, we see that becomes a crucial element and a crucial argument of the administration and the fear that if Vietnam falls, other countries would fall as well. So the United States under Eisenhower will encourage Vietnam to actually split basically North and South, with the idea that eventually they'd be allowed to have these free elections and they would get to self-determine what kind of a government they wanted. They kind of tried that in 1945, right? And we told them no. Well, now it's 1954 and we're saying, we're going to allow you to do self-determination. Now, in the Northern Forces, Ho Chi Minh is a communist state, and most of the individuals up there are pretty well communist leaning. In fact, the vast majority of people in Vietnam wouldn't mind going more towards communism and under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. But in the South, we don't want that to occur, so we back up a government led by Ngo Dinh Diem, and Diem happens to be a French-educated Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, background with French-educated Roman Catholic, right? He is a very stringent Roman Catholic, but he is more democratic-leaning than the others. Now, the reality of Diem is he doesn't really want much of a democracy, and he doesn't believe in religious toleration whatsoever at all. In fact, he wants the Buddhists to go away and for everybody to be forced into converting into Catholicism, because that's kind of how the Roman Catholic faith historically has been, right? I mean, you just become a Catholic because that's what you do. So we are initially backing him and his pro-democracy regime. Eisenhower very early on then will send advisors to Vietnam in 55. There's only 50 advisors that are sent. Most of these are CIA trained. The idea is that they would help support the development of a democracy in Vietnam. Okay? Well, 1956 comes and the elections are supposed to occur, and it becomes very, very evident that Diem is going to lose, largely because of things like this. Diem is not very nice to his people, especially not very nice to the Buddhists. And so in protest of Diem's regime and his harsh treatment of the Buddhist individuals, the monks of South Vietnam light themselves on fire in protest of Diem, which is extreme, right? I mean, you're saying a lot if you're saying I'm willing to light myself on fire in protest of who you are. Well, this comes to light, and the United States is kind of like, yeah, Diem, we need to back Diem, but but Diem's going to lose, largely because of the fact that he doesn't have the support of his people. But we need Diem to win because it's a democracy, right? So how do we deal with this? Well, the reality of it is that we don't really deal with it, and Vietnam erupts into a civil war. Now, as Eisenhower then is leaving, we're still officially backing the regime of Diem. And now Kennedy comes into the White House, and now Kennedy almost immediately has to deal with the mess that Eisenhower's left behind for him. Not just in Cuba with the failed invasion, Bay of Pigs invasion, but now he also has to deal with the whole mess going on over in Vietnam also. So Kennedy really kind of walks into a poop storm when it comes to his foreign policies in the White House, or foreign relations in the White House. So Kennedy, using his flexible response, decides we're going to send some Green Berets over, and those Green Berets will help support Diem and hopefully kind of sort of quell some of the tensions. And he increases the number of advisors he has to 1,600 people are now in Vietnam. Okay? Now, more and more of this stuff keeps coming to light, and Kennedy can't really continue to back this guy when people are lighting themselves on fire. Kind of hard to support Diem when his people are saying, we don't want you.
Watch as I burn.
Watch as I burn. We don't want you, right? And so John F. Kennedy actually supports a military coup in 1963 that leads to the overthrow of Diem and actually the assassination of both Diem and his brother. No more Diem.
Nice.
Yay! Unfortunately, about 2.5, 3 weeks later, Kennedy is assassinated. So there's no new leader set up in Vietnam when Kennedy dies, and now Johnson now has to deal with the mess that Kennedy kind of left behind, because Kennedy didn't intend to leave a mess behind, but did because
He died.
Died, right? And so now there's a mess left behind
Why, Jesse?
that now Johnson has to deal with. Okay? Now,
Cuban crush by the slapper.
Johnson enters in the White House in 1963, and Johnson, what we see happen as he enters, right? Troop deployment is really low, 63, 64, okay? Johnson, 64, 65, 66, 67.
This is a lot of
Whew,
troops.
right? Our number of troops in Vietnam increased dramatically as Johnson takes the White House because he is very afraid of this thing called the domino theory, that if Vietnam falls to communism, so will the rest of Southeast Asia. Now, at first, he doesn't really get a lot of congressional backing for this whole domino theory business until there's something that happens. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and it leads to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And basically, Gulf of Tonkin, we have some U.S. ships, okay, some battleships that are hanging out in the Gulf of Tonkin. That's why it's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? And it's off the coast of North Vietnam. Imagine that, right? We're really creative. It's off the coast of North Vietnam, and there's a question of whether or not our ships are in North Vietnamese waters or if we're in free international waters. Now, according to Johnson, he goes to what happens to those ships then is they're actually attacked by the North Vietnamese. Johnson goes to Congress and asks Congress to basically give him a blank check to go after the North Vietnamese because the ships were attacked and that they didn't do anything to deserve being attacked. We were unprovoked. So he's really kind of connecting these ideas of Pearl Harbor to Gulf of Tonkin, right? Look at what happens to our ships who are unattacked. We didn't do anything to deserve this. We have to fight this, right? And so Congress gives the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is basically a blank check to Johnson, hands over their war powers to Johnson, and says, go fix it.
Sounds like a great plan.
Sounds like an amazing plan, right? Except for not so much, okay? Now, what ensues then as a result of that is that Johnson will escalate our troop involvement in Vietnam dramatically. So much so that by 1965, there are 184,000 American troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1968, there are over 500,000 troops in Vietnam within a very short time span. Now, for that, then, we will use both a ground war and an air war. Air war will use what's called Operation Rolling Thunder, where it's basically where we just go through and we carpet bomb large swaths of land.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we just let out bombs and push them out the door, and wherever they fall, yay, they fall. The other thing that we used a lot was Agent Orange and napalm. Wait a second. Those are chemical weapons, right? And I thought that the Geneva Convention said you can't use chemical weaponry. Whatever.
Well,
We're Americans.
Technically, Agent Orange wasn't a chemical weapon because it only destroyed the foliage.
Yes, it was just a defoliant. It's not a chemical weapon. It doesn't hurt people. So therefore, we can use Agent Orange, right?
Exactly.
Except for it hurts everyone, including American troops who inhaled it while they were fighting in the jungles, right? But the defoliant was needed because you're fighting in a very dense jungle. It's very hot, it's very humid, it's very difficult to find the enemy, and we don't really know who the enemy is. We can't tell the difference between the Viet Cong, which were the guerrilla warriors that weren't attached to the North Vietnamese army. They were South Vietnamese people, but they were fighting under the realm or with the North Vietnamese, and the regular old Vietnamese. We can't tell the difference between them because they don't wear uniforms. Funny thing how that works. Okay, they don't wear uniforms, and so we don't know who we're really fighting, and we can't find what we call the Charlies. Okay, and so we run around basically killing everyone because it's better to kill everyone than to kill like someone's and then wind up getting killed anyways because right there's more people there that are your enemy, and you don't really know who your enemy is. So we run around, and our ground war then consists of basically we would go into an area, we would destroy, it's called the search and destroy missions, and we would go on what were called Zippo raids, literally Zippo raids because you would bust out your Zippo lighter and light things on fire. And that's how you found and got rid of the enemy. So we would walk into villages and we would light their little huts on fire. Enemy, shmenemy. Okay? The reality of it was it's a very bloody process. It takes an extreme amount of time. We're not used to fighting in that kind of warfare. We're walking through jungles. Our troops, their feet are constantly wet, and so they deal with jungle rot, which is very similar to the trench foot of World War I, but we call it jungle rot because, you know, you're in the jungle, not in the trenches, but it's basically the same kind of concept where your feet basically get gangrene and rot because they never actually dry out. They're wet constantly. And you were walking through jungles that were dense with what's called elephant grass, which is a really... Are you looking at a picture of jungle rot right now, Case? His face back there, he's like, ew, okay.
I gotta check.
So... they also these really, really dense forests, and they had this stuff that was called elephant grass. And elephant grass is a really, really thick grass that almost is like a blade that will literally like cut you. And so it was difficult fighting, and this process doesn't work very well for us. And on top of that, you have Ho Chi Minh arguing, look, you can kill 10 of my dudes to every one of yours that I kill, and I will still win.
No jungle foot.
Because simply, I will continue to fight you until you no longer want to fight in this war. You will give up before I run out of people. Which is true. It happens. Now, given all of this stuff that's going on, we largely are tallying our victory based off of the body count of the enemy on television. And it's being portrayed on TV constantly. So we are getting images brought into our television sets, like this one, but also we begin to start seeing images in 67, 68, like this one. And these images are broadcast to Americans, and now here we have our lovely military and our news reporters, right? And here we have them taking images, and this is coming towards them. This is a napalm air attack, so it's burning behind them. And you have these poor children running away, in some cases completely naked, running away, fleeing what is going on. And that's coming across in the American televisions. But that's okay, because in 1967, General William Westmoreland, who's in charge of all of the forces in Vietnam, is saying that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Basically, the war is going to come to an end really, really soon. Except for, in 1968, the North Vietnamese launch, with the help of about 670,000 Viet Cong, they launch an assault on southern Vietnam, okay? And it is a very, very well coordinated attack. And on that Tet New Year, which is January 30th, I'm almost positive it's the 30th of January is the Tet New Year. Yeah, 30th of January. On that day, they do a coordinated attack and strike 100 cities all at once. Now, it's not actually a big victory for the North Vietnamese or for Ho Chi Minh and his forces, but it is a huge morale defeat for the Americans. And here you have Westmoreland saying, we can see light at the end of the tunnel. In 67, right, the war is coming to a close. But yet, 68, we have this announcement that, oh, well, this Tet Offensive thing kind of happened, and that was not so good for the Americans. It didn't work out very well for us. As a result of Tet Offensive, Americans start to wonder whether or not that we should continue to actually fight in this war. And we begin to see more and more critics of the policies of Johnson and of the fight towards that war, okay? We see individuals begin to protest using things such as sit-ins, okay, or teach-ins, right? Things that we learned how to do during what?
The Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah, right, just reapplied to the Vietnam movement, okay? And we begin to see a lot more protests. We and see an increase in the draft dodge. In 65, there's only about 5,000 people per month that are dodging the draft. By end of 67, beginning of 68, there are over 50,000 that are dodging the draft. Okay, so that number is increased quite dramatically, and just by looking at that, you can see that American forces are not wanting to fight in the war. Something to note about that is that the average age of the people fighting in Vietnam is much lower than that of World War II. In World War II, the average age was 26. Okay, in Vietnam, the average age was like 19 and a half. Okay, so the age was much younger. And somebody asked me, well, why is that? Well, you have to realize that it's because of the baby boomer generation. It's because of World War II. Because during World War II, when those men get out of the war, they're already older when they are having their children. Does that make sense? So by the time those kids are old enough to be going off to Vietnam, or to be fighting for their country, to be drafted, they're younger just because of this time span of their dads being off fighting in World War II. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay? And so that's why we see a younger age. But because of that younger age of our troops, it also, Americans largely push back against that younger age, because it's a lot more difficult to watch very young men go off and fight in the war than watch older individuals fight in the war. Plus, during this time frame, you could not vote unless you were
21
years of age. So you could go and fight and die for your country, but you didn't have a voice or a vote in who was leading you, who was your commander-in-chief, who was telling you where you were going to go and fight this war and die in the war.
Yes.
Right? So there's a problem with that. And Americans largely began to push back against Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so we see things like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And hell no, we won't go. Okay, and different protest chants to prevent or to say we don't want to go and fight in this war. Okay? Now, in 68 then, as a result of the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite goes on air. And Walter Cronkite basically is the face of American news during that time frame, and actually even after that time frame, and to a certain extent all the way up almost until he dies. You know, he's a big person in our news in America, right? And Walter Cronkite goes on and he says, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience in Vietnam is going to end in a stalemate. The only rational way out is to negotiate." Johnson sees this, or hears this, and he says, "If I've lost Walter, then it's over. I've lost Mr. Average Citizen." His public support plunges from about 40% to 20%. Okay? People do not like Johnson, okay? And as a result of that, it's 1968. 1968 is a
election year.
Yeah, we're going into an election year, right? So it's 1968, and Johnson says, "I will not seek my party or accept my party's nomination for the office of presidency for re-election. I'm not even going to go after it." Does that make sense? As a result, the Democrats will nominate, he gets shot in California.
Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah, Robert Kennedy, okay? Now, as a result of him getting shot, then Johnson's VP, Humphrey, will actually become the Democratic candidate. The Republicans will nominate Richard Nixon, and there will also be a third party that's run, the American Independent Party, led by Governor George Wallace. And if you remember him, he is the dude that said,
"Segregation today,
segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever," right? He's that dude.
Segregation.
And he argues in his campaign that we should bomb Vietnam back to the Stone Age.
We should bomb Vietnam.
He doesn't win. Nixon does win, but not by a whole lot. Okay, in fact, Nixon only receives a 1% majority, or majority of the popular vote. So he doesn't get much of a majority of that vote, but he does win largely because the Democratic vote is split between Wallace and Humphrey. But Nixon's winning the war, or winning the election, he promises a de-escalation. Now, as Johnson is the lame duck president and Nixon is on his way in, we learn of an event that occurs in 1968, but we don't find out about it until 1969, and that's the My Lai Massacre. And in the My Lai Massacre, what we find out is that a guy by the name of Lieutenant Cawley massacred 350 civilians in a small village in Vietnam. Just flat out wiped him out. Now he tells, when he is court-martialed for it, he says that he was ordered to do so. He was told he had to do it, and he was merely following orders. The problem with it is it's 1968 when this occurs, 1969 when it's revealed to the public, and although he is court-martialed, he only actually gets 10 years in jail. 10 years for killing 350 people. Because he says, I was ordered to do so. I was just following orders. You have to realize, okay, it's 68, 69, right? We are not that far out from the Nuremberg trials in which Germans, Nazi officers, even higher-ups within Hitler's military forces and his political regime said, I was just following orders. Americans are outraged that Cawley gets such a, basically, what they deem as a slap on the wrist. And here again, it is proof of the American government lying to the people about what is going on in Vietnam. That things are not as good as they want to appear. As a result of that, as a result of Tet Offensive, there begins in 1968 peace talks in Paris to try to negotiate that peace. But that largely falls apart pretty early on. Now, Nixon argues for a policy that he calls Vietnamization. Basically, the idea here is that we would train the Vietnamese to be able to take over fighting, and then the U.S. troops could leave, and they would be able to keep fighting, and things would be okay. And it would totally work, because the people of Vietnam would be able to hold their own without the U.S. forces. Kind of like the people of Afghanistan or the people of Iraq. They also would be able to hold their own without U.S. forces there to support.
Wait, none of those worked, though.
Oh. Darn it. But that becomes his plan, right? Vietnamization, right? That's why, again, isn't history education so important? Okay, but he begins and he says we need to have peace with honor. Now, at the same time that he is calling for de-escalation, and he actually gets elected on that idea that he is going to de-escalate Vietnam, at the exact same time, he begins bombing raids of Cambodia. Wait, de-escalation? Or escalation?
Nixon.
Did you misspeak, Nixon? Because I'm pretty sure you said de-escalation, peace with honor. How does Cambodia come into this mix?
He also tried to play good cop with Vietnam, but forgot good cop.
Yeah.
So he was quoted saying, because he was trying to convince them that he was crazy and they needed to make peace. So he was like, I'm going to bomb the hell out of them with the nukes. And they're like, you got to stop Nixon, he's crazy. But there was no one for the Vietnamese to turn to, so just the president threatened to Vietnam.
Yeah.
They're like, he's got his finger on the button and everything.
It was really ridiculous. I mean,
What a mess in American
history.
history.
So much for that. So anyways, in addition to that, in April of 1970, he actually sends troops into Cambodia. Now, his whole reasoning for bombing Cambodia and sending troops in there is because part of the reason the North Vietnamese have been able to hold out this long is because they have this trail. It's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is a supply trail that runs through Cambodia and Laos. And without us actually bombing that trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the North Vietnamese are continually able to resupply the Viet Cong in the south with new troops and weapons and all sorts of things, right? So that's kind of why he begins that bombing raid. But, again, it's an escalation, and Americans don't like that escalation because they elected Nixon in part because he promised a de-escalation. And so as a result of that, protests increase, and in May 3rd, 4th, 1970, students begin protesting at Kent State, which is in Ohio. And also, there are some other protests that occur later in Jacksonville, Florida, at an all-African-American school in Florida. And at both of those, what happens at Kent State is the National Guard opens fire on the protesters. 4 students are killed. Another 11 students are wounded. At Kent, or in Florida, 2 students are killed. Another 10 students are wounded. Wait, now the American government is shooting our own people for peacefully protesting?